The first consul had not been long installed in St. Cloud when this chateau once more become a sovereign residence, was very nearly a prey to flames. There was a guardhouse under the vestibule of the center of the palace. One night when the soldiers had made too much fire, the stove became so hot that an armchair which was shoved against one of the hot air holes which warmed the salon took fire, and the flame promptly communicated itself to all the furniture. The officer of the post, noticing it immediately, notified the concierge, and they ran to the room of General Duroc, whom they awakened. The general rose in all haste, and recommending perfect silence, they organized a chain. He got into the reservoir himself, together with the concierge, to pass the buckets of water to the soldiers, and in 2 or 3 hours the fire, which had already devoured all the furniture, was extinct. It was not until the next morning that the first consul, Josephine Hortense, in a word, all the inhabitants of the chateau, were apprised of this accident, and they all testified, the first consul especially, their gratitude for the care that had been taken not to awaken them, to prevent such accidents, or at least to render them less dangerous in future. The first consul organized a night guard at St. Cloud, and in the sequel, in all his residences. This guard was called the Watch Chamber. In the early days of the first consul's residence in the palace of St. Cloud, he slept in the same bed with his wife. Etiquette supervened later on, and in this respect, somewhat chilled conjugal tenderness. In effect, the first consul ended by occupying an apartment rather remote from that of Madame Bonaparte. To go to her, he had to pass through a long servants' corridor. The ladies of the palace, the serving women, etc., had rooms on either side of it. When the first consul wished to pass the night with his wife, he undressed in his own room, whence he issued in a dressing gown and a bandana handkerchief around his head. I walked in front of him carrying a flambeau. At the end of this corridor was a staircase of 15 or 16 steps, which led to Madame Bonaparte's apartment. It was a great joy for her to receive a visit from her husband. The whole house heard of it the next day. I see her still saying to every newcomer and rubbing her little hands, I got up late today, but you see it is because Bonaparte came to spend the night with me. On that day she would still be more amiable than usual. She repelled nobody, and we could obtain whatever we wanted. For my part, I have often tried the experiment. One evening when I was conducting the first consul to one of these conjugal visits, we perceived in the corridor a very well-dressed young man who was coming out of the room of one of Madame Bonaparte's women. He tried to slip away, but the first consul cried out in a loud voice, Who is there? Where are you going? What are you doing? What is your game? It was simply one of Madame Bonaparte's valets. Stupefied by these hasty interrogations, he replied in a frightened voice that he had been executing a commission for Madame Bonaparte. All right, returned the first consul, but don't let me find you here again. Persuaded that the gallant would profit by the lesson, the general did not seek to learn his name or that of his fair friend. That reminds me that he was much more severe in regard to another lady's maid of Madame Bonaparte. She was young and very pretty, and inspired very tender sentiments into aides de camp, Monsieur R and E. They sighed incessantly at her door and sent her flowers and billets doux, love letters. The young girl, at least such was the general opinion of the household, gave them nothing in return. Josephine liked her very much, and yet the first consul, having noticed the gallantries of these gentlemen, displayed great anger and had the poor young woman sent away in spite of her tears and the entreaties of Madame Bonaparte and those of the brave and good Colonel R, who naively swore that the fault was all on his side, that the poor little thing deserved nothing but praise and had never listened to him. All was unavailing against the resolution of the first consul, who replied to everything by saying, I will have no disorders, no scandals in my house. Whenever the first consul made a distribution of weapons of honor, there was a banquet at the Tuileries to which all were admitted indiscriminately, no matter what their grade might be, who had shared in these rewards. There were sometimes 200 guests at these dinners, which were served in the grand gallery of the chateau. General Duroc was master of ceremonies, and the first consul was careful to recommend him to intermingle common soldiers, colonels, generals, etc. It was the former especially that he ordered the domestics to take good care of and give them plenty to eat and drink. These were the longest repasts I ever saw given by the emperor. Here he showed a perfect amiability and unconstraint. He made every effort to put his guests at their ease, but with a good many of them he had trouble doing so. Nothing was funnier than to see these honest troopers holding themselves 2 feet away from the table, not daring to approach either their napkin or their bread, red to their ears and their necks stretched towards their general as if to receive the countersign. The first consul would make them relate the lofty deed which had earned them the national reward, and sometimes shouted with laughter at their singular narrations. He persuaded them to make a good meal, and sometimes drank to their health, but with some his encouragements failed to overcome their timidity, and the footmen would take away their plates one after another without their having touched them. This constraint did not prevent them from being full of joy and enthusiasm when quitting the table. Au revoir, my heroes, the first consul would say to them. Baptize those newborn babies for me as soon as possible, pointing with his fingers at their sabers of honor. God knows what they did not fail to do so when the opportunity came. This kindliness of the first consul towards common soldiers reminds me of an anecdote that happened at Malmaison, and which gives another reply to those accusations of pride and severity that have been made against him. The first consul went out very early one morning, dressed in his gray overcoat and accompanied by General Duroc, to walk in the direction of the machinery of Marly. As they were walking and talking, they saw a laborer who was tracing a furrow and coming towards them. Say, my good fellow, said the first consul, stopping, your furrow is not straight. Don't you know your trade? At any rate, you can't teach it to me, my fine gentleman. You would find it very hard work to do as well. Nonsense! You think so? Well, try it, replied the honest man, ceding his place to the first consul. The latter took the handle of the plow and, urging on the horses, wanted to commence the lesson, but he did not make a single step in a straight line, so awkwardly did he take hold. Come, come, said the peasant, laying his hand on that of the general to take back his plow. Your work is good for nothing. Every one to his trade. You go and take a walk. That is your business. But the first consul did not continue his walk without paying for the lesson in morals he had just received from the laborer. General Duroc gave him 2 or 3 louis to reimburse him for the loss of time they had caused him. The peasant, astonished by this generosity, left his plow to go and tell his adventure, and on the road met a woman to whom he said that he certainly thought he had met 2 big gentlemen, gros monsieur, to judge of them by what he still had in his hand. The farmer's wife, better advised, asked him how. The 2 promenaders were dressed, and from his description divined that it was the first consul and one of his friends. The good man was dumbfounded for a time, but the next day he took a fine resolution, and having arrayed himself in his best clothes, he presented himself at Malmaison and asked to speak to the first consul to thank him, as he said, for the fine present he had made him the day before. I went to inform the first consul of this visit, and he ordered me to introduce the laborer. The latter, while I was absent on this errand, had, to use his own expression, take his courage in both hands to prepare himself for this great interview. I found him standing in the middle of the antechamber, for he had not dared to sit down on the benches which, although of the simplest, appeared to him magnificent. Dreaming of what he was going to say to the first consul to show his gratitude, I marched before him, he following, putting his feet down on the carpet with the utmost precaution, and when I opened the door of the cabinet for him, politely urging me to go in first. When the first consul had nothing secret to say or dictate, he was willing enough to leave the door of his cabinet open. This time he made me a sign not to close it, so that I could see and hear all that passed. The honest laborer commenced on entering the cabinet by saluting the back of Monsieur de Bourrienne, who could not see him, occupied as he was in writing at a little table placed in the embrasure of the window. The first consul looked at him, making his salutes, threw himself back in his armchair, one of whose arms he was, as usual, tormenting with a penknife. At last, however, he began to speak in this fashion. Well, my good fellow. The peasant turned round, recognized him, and saluted again. Well, pursued the first consul, has the harvest been good this year? But, saving your presence, citizen my general, it has not been so bad as all that. To make the earth bring forth, resumed the first consul, it must be dug up. Isn't that so? Fine gentlemen are good for nothing at that work. Without offense to you, General, the hands of the bourgeois are too soft to manage a plow. It needs a solid fist to move those tools. That's true, responded the first consul, smiling. But big and strong as you are, you ought to be able to handle something besides a plow. A good musket, for example, or else the hilt of a fine saber. The laborer drew himself up with an air of pride. General, in my time, I have done like the others. I had been married 5 years when those of Russians, pardon, General, entered Landrecies. The requisition came. They gave me a musket and cartridge box at the townhouse and march. Well, we were not equipped like those big fellows I saw just now in entering the court. He met the grenadiers of the consular guard. Why did you quit the service? Continued the first consul, who seemed to take great interest in this conversation. Faith, General, everyone in his turn. There are saber thrusts. Enough for all. One hit me here. The worthy laborer stooped and showed his head, pushed aside the hair, and after several weeks in the hospital, they gave me leave to return to my wife and my plow. Have you any children? I have 3, General, 2 boys and a girl. You must make a soldier of your oldest boy, if he behaves himself well. I will take charge of him. Adieu, my good fellow. When you have need of me, come back to see me. Thereupon the first consul rose, asked Monsieur de Bourrienne for some louis, which he added to those the laborer had already received from him, and ordered me to take him away. We were already in the antechamber when the first consul called the laborer back to say, Were you at Fleurus? Yes, General. Could you tell me the name of your general-in-chief? Well, I should think so. It's General Jourdain. Good. Au revoir. And I let the old soldier of the Republic away, enchanted with his reception. Chapter 11. At the beginning of this year, 1803, there arrived in Paris an envoy from Tunis, who presented the first consul in the name of the Bey with 10 Arabian horses. The Bey was then in dread of the wrath of England, and he was trying to secure France as a powerful ally who would be able to protect him. He could not have done better, for everything announced the rupture of that peace of Amiens so greatly rejoiced over by all of Europe. England kept none of its promises and executed not a single article of the treaty. On his side, the first consul, revolted by such bad faith and unwilling to be duped by it, armed publicly, ordered the complement of officers to be filled up and a new levy of 120,000 conscripts. War was officially declared in June, but there had been hostilities before that. At the end of the month, the first consul made a journey to Bologna and visited Picardy, Flanders, and Belgium to organize the expedition he meditated against the English and to put the northern coasts in a state of defense. Returning to Paris in August, he left it again in November for a second visit to Bologna. These repeated jaunts were too much for Monsieur Ambar, first valet de chambre, who had long been sick. Hence, when the first consul had been on the point of setting out his first tour of the north, Monsieur Ambar had asked his permission not to be of the party, alleging, which was very true, the bad state of his health. That is the way you are, said the first consul, always sick and complaining. If you stay here, who is going to shave me? General, replied Monsieur Ambar, Constant knows how to shave as well as I do. I was present and occupied at that very moment in dressing the first consul. He looked at me and said, Hey, Monsieur le Drôle, funny guy, since you are so clever, you may make your trial on the spot. We shall see how you will go at it. I knew the mishap of poor Hébert, which I have previously related, and not wishing to experience one like it, I had been long learning to shave. I had paid a barber to teach me his trade, and had even in my leisure moments apprenticed myself at his shop, where I had shaved all his customers indiscriminately. The chins of these worthy people had somewhat to suffer before my hand was light enough for me to dare to bring my razor near the consular chin, but by dint of reiterated experiences on the beards of the vulgar, I had arrived at a degree of address which inspired me with the greatest confidence. Hence, on the first consul's order, I got ready the hot water and soap ball, opened the razor boldly, and I began the operation. Just as I was about to bring the razor to the first consul's face, he rose brusquely, turned round, and fixed his 2 eyes on me with an expression of severity and interrogation which I cannot describe. Seeing that I remained undisturbed, he sat down again, saying with more gentleness, Continue. which I did with sufficient address to satisfy him very well. When I had finished, he said to me, Hereafter it is you that shall shave me. And in fact, from that time he would have no other barber. Thenceforward my duties became much more active, for every day I was obliged to make my appearance to shave the first consul, and I can affirm that it was no easy thing to do. During the ceremony of removing his beard, he frequently talked, read the papers, moved round his chair, turned suddenly, and I was obliged to use the greatest precaution to avoid wounding him. Luckily, the misfortune never happened to me. When by chance he did not talk, he remained immovable and stiff as a statue, and one could not make him lower, raise, or bend his head, as would have been necessary in order to accomplish the task more easily. He had also one singular mania, which was to have only one side of his face lathered and shaved at a time. He would never let me pass to the other side until the first side was finished. The first consul found this more convenient. Later on, when I had become his first valet de chambre, when he deigned to treat me with the greatest kindness, and I had as much freedom of speech with him as his rank permitted, I took the liberty of persuading him to shave himself, for, as I have just said, being unwilling to allow himself to be shaved by anybody but me, he was obliged to wait to have me sent for. With the army especially, where he was not always regular about rising, he refused for a long time to follow my advice, and whenever I repeated it, "Aha, Mr. Laziness," he would say to me, laughing, "wouldn't you be very glad to have me do half your work?" At last, I had the good fortune to convince him of the disinterestedness and the wisdom of my advice. The fact is that I wanted very much to persuade him, for, representing to myself what would necessarily happen if an indispensable absence, a malady, or any other motive should keep me at a distance from the first consul, I could not think without a shudder that his life would be at the mercy of the first comer. For him, I am sure he never thought of this, for whatever stories have been told about his distrust, it is certain that he never took any precautions against the snares that treachery might lay for him. His confidence on this point versed even on imprudence, hence all who loved him, and they were all who surrounded him, sought to remedy this lack of precaution by all the vigilance of which they were capable. I need not say that it was above all this very solicitude for the precious life of my master which induced me to insist on the advice I had given him to shave himself. The first times when he essayed to put my lessons into practice, it was more disquieting than laughable to see the emperor, he was that then, who did not know how to hold the razor in spite of the principles I had just laid down, illustrating them by reiterated examples, seizing it by the handle, and apply it perpendicularly to his cheek without laying it flat. He would make an abrupt slash with it, never failing to cut himself, and then draw back his hand as quickly as possible, exclaiming, "You see very well, you rogue. You are the cause of my cutting myself." And I would take the razor and finish the operation. The next day, the same scene as the day before, but with less bloodshed. Every day increased the emperor's skill, and he ended by dint of repeated lessons in being able to dispense with me. Only still, he cut himself occasionally, and then he would begin again to scold me a little, but in a bantering way and kindly. Besides, from the manner in which he went at it, and which he would not change, it was very possible that he would never avoid cutting himself frequently, for he shaved himself from top to bottom, and not from bottom to top like everybody else. And this bad method, which all my efforts could never alter, added to the habitual abruptness of his movements, made it impossible for me not to shudder every time I saw him take his razor. Madame Bonaparte accompanied the first consul on the first of these journeys. Like that to Lyons, it was a continual series of fetes and triumphs. In expectation of the arrival of the first consul, the inhabitants of Bologna had raised the triumphal arches all the way from Montreuil Gate to the temporary building erected for him at the camp at the right. Each arch was of foliage and bore the names of the combats and pitched battles in which he had been victorious. These domes and arcades of verdure and flowers presented an admirable sight. One of them, much higher than the others, rose in the middle of the Rue des Coups, the chief street. The elite of the city were assembled around it, more than 100 young persons adorned with flowers. Children, fine old men, and a large number of veterans who had not been detained in camp by military duty were awaiting the arrival of the first consul with impatience. As he approached, rejoicing cannons announced to the English, whose fleet was still lying in Bologna waters, the appearance of Napoleon on the shore where the formidable army had resolved to throw into England was assembling. The first consul, who had been mounted on a little gray horse which had the vivacity of a squirrel, alighted, and followed by his brilliant staff, he addressed these paternal words to the city authorities. I come to assure the welfare of France. The sentiments you manifest, your tokens of gratitude, all affect me. I shall never forget my entry into Bologna, which I have chosen as a center of reunion for my armies. Citizens, do not be alarmed by this rendezvous. It is that of the defenders of the country, and presently of the conquerors of haughty England. The first consul continued his march, surrounded by the whole population, who only left him at the door of his barrack, where more than 30 generals received him. The firing of cannons, the ringing of bells, the shouts of joy lasted until nightfall. The next day after our arrival, the first consul visited the Pont de Brix, a little village situated half a league from Bologna. A farmer read him the following compliment. General, we 20 are fathers of families who offer you a score of big fellows who are and always will be at your orders. Take them with you, General. They may aid you serviceably when you go to England. As we are fulfilling another duty, our arms will cultivate the earth so that bread shall not be lacking to the heroes who are to crush the English. Napoleon smilingly thanked the outspoken countryman, glanced at a small country house built beside the high road, and said, addressing himself to General Berthier, I will have my headquarters established there. Then he spurred his horse and rode away. A general and several officers remained to execute his order, and the first consul returned the same night to sleep at Pont de Brix. I was told at Bologna the details of a naval combat fought a short time before our arrival between the French fleet, commanded by Admiral Brie, and the English squadron with which Nelson was blocking the port of Bologna. I will tell them, as they were told to me, as I thought the convenient manner in which the French admiral directed the operations of his seamen. Very curious. About 200 vessels, both gunboats and bomb ketches, flatboats and pinnaces, formed the line of defense. The coast and the forts were bristling with batteries. Several frigates detached themselves from the enemy's station and, preceded by 2 or 3 brigs, got into battle array in front of the line and within range of the cannon of our flotilla. Then the fight began, and the balls came from every direction. Nelson had promised the destruction of the flotilla, reinforced his line of battle by 2 other ranks of vessels and frigates. Thus placed in echelon, they fought with great superiority in forces for more than 7 hours. The sea, covered with fire and smoke, offered to the whole population of Bologna the superb and frightful spectacle of a naval combat, where more than 1,800 cannon were discharged at once. Nelson's genius could do nothing against our sailors and soldiers. Admiral Brie was in his barrack, which was placed near the coast telegraph of signals. He fought Nelson from there, drinking with his staff and several ladies of Bologna, whom he had invited to dinner. The guests were chanting the first victories of the first consul, while the admiral, without leaving the table, maneuvered the flotilla by means of the signals he ordered. Nelson, impatient to conquer, brought forward all his naval forces, but the wind being against him, he could not keep the promise he had made in London to burn our flotilla. Far from that, several of his vessels were badly damaged, and Admiral Brie, seeing the English drawing off, shouted victory while pouring champagne for his guests. The French flotilla had not suffered much, while the enemy's squadron had been ruined by the continual firing of our stationary batteries. On that day, the English recognized that it would be impossible for them to approach the coast of Bologna, which they have since surnamed Iron Coast, Côte de Fer. When the first consul quitted Bologna, he was to go to Abbeville and remain there 24 hours. The mayor of that town had neglected nothing to receive him worthily. Abbeville was superb on that day. The most beautiful trees in a neighboring wood had been dug up by their roots to form avenues in all the streets through which the first consul was to pass. Several inhabitants who owned magnificent gardens had sent their rarest shrubs to range along his route. Carpets from the manufactory of Messrs. Eke Dorval were stretched on the ground to be trodden by his horses. An unexpected circumstance suddenly disturbed the fete. A courier expedited by the Minister of Police arrived just as we were approaching the city. The minister warned the first consul that they meant to assassinate him 2 leagues from there. The day and hour were indicated. To frustrate the intended attack against his person, the first consul passed through the city on a gallop and, followed by several lancers, went to the place where he was to be attacked. There he made a halt of about half an hour, ate some Abbeville biscuits, and went back again. The assassins were tricked. Their preparations had been made for the next day. The first consul and Madame Bonaparte continued their journey across Picardy, Flanders, and the Low Countries. War vessels were daily offered him by the different consuls general. They continued to address him and to present him with the keys of cities as if he were exercising by royal power. Amiens, Dunkirk, Lille, Bruges, Ghent, Brussels, Liège, Namur distinguished themselves by the brilliancy of the reception they gave the illustrious travelers. The inhabitants of the city of Antwerp presented the first consul with 6 magnificent bay horses. Likewise, the first consul left behind him serviceable marks of his passage. By his orders, the works were at once begun for cleaning and improving the port of Amiens. In this city and in others, when it was going on, he visited the exhibition of industrial products, encouraging the manufacturers by his counsels and assisting them by his decrees. At Liège, he placed at the disposal of the prefect of Urta a sum of 300,000 francs for the repair of the houses burned by the Austrians in this department during the first wars of the Revolution. Antwerp owed to him its inner port, its basins, and its dockyards. At Brussels, he ordered the junction of the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt by a canal. He caused a stone bridge to be thrown over the Meuse at Givet, and at Sedan, the window. Rousseau received from him a sum of 60,000 francs for the rebuilding of her factory, which had been destroyed by fire. In fine, I could not enumerate all the benefits, public or private, which the first consul and Madame Bonaparte strewed along their route.